Lewis Hamilton has been abruptly fired by Ferrari's top executives following the Bahrain Grand Prix. Since this is likely the first video you're watching about this shocking development, I highly recommend you pay close attention to understand the real reason behind Lewis Hamilton's dismissal, a move that has taken all of us by surprise. It was supposed to be just another race weekend on the calendar. Nothing more, nothing less. A stop in Suzuka, one of Formula One's most beloved circuits, known for its figure-8 layout, its unpredictable weather, and its fiercely loyal Japanese fans. The atmosphere was electric, as expected. Fans lined the fences waving flags with names like Leclerc, Hamilton, and signs printed on them, and the sound of engines echoed through the paddock like distant thunder. At first glance, everything appeared as it should. But within the pristine facade of the Ferrari garage, beneath the glossy paint and the polished chrome, something was festering. Something that had been growing slowly, in whispers and sidelong glances, in altered schedules and behind-the-scenes meetings. Something so corrosive that when it finally surfaced, it didn't just fracture Ferrari's internal structure, it sent shockwaves across the entire paddock. The story, as it would be whispered later by team insiders, traveling through encrypted messages and hushed conversations in media centers, wasn't about a technical mishap or a racing incident. It was about pride, power, trust broken so completely it could never be put back together. And at the center of it all stood two of the sport's most iconic figures, caught in a firestorm of ambition, ego, politics, and betrayal: Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton. Hamilton's arrival at Ferrari had been one of the most seismic driver transfers in recent F1 history. After nearly 2 decades associated with McLaren and Mercedes, his decision to don the iconic red suit sent the media into a frenzy and lit a fire under Ferrari's hopes for a championship resurrection. The world watched as the 7-time world champion walked into Maranello, eyes filled with determination, ready to write the final, and potentially most glorious chapter of his career. But from the very beginning, there were subtle signs that not everything was as harmonious as the press releases suggested. Leclerc, the young prince of Ferrari, a driver who had built his career under the Scuderia's banner, found himself sharing the spotlight with a living legend. And although both men smiled for the cameras and exchanged compliments during interviews, their partnership was never truly balanced. Leclerc had deep roots within the team. Hamilton had the pedigree. And somewhere between these two realities, tension began to simmer. That tension reached a boiling point behind closed doors on a quiet Thursday evening before the first practice session in Suzuka. In a technical briefing held in one of Ferrari's heavily secured rooms, both drivers were present along with their race engineers, key members of the technical department, and several top-ranking team officials. The air was thick with analysis, tire degradation projections, brake temperature data, aero maps, strategy outlines. Everything seemed routine. But then, in a moment that would later become infamous, a junior engineer, perhaps a little too eager, let something slip that was not meant to be heard, at least not yet. He mentioned that Charles would be trialing a new floor upgrade during FP1, a highly anticipated component. A floor spec that both drivers had been briefed on, and which Hamilton had specifically been told would be implemented equally across both cars. There was a pause. Not long. Just a few seconds. But long enough. Hamilton didn't raise his voice. He didn't interrupt. He simply turned his head, very slowly, and looked directly at the aerodynamicist who was now nervously shifting in his seat. "Can you repeat that?" Lewis asked, his voice calm but firm. The room went dead silent. The engineer stammered. "Charles's car is running the new floor. Just for comparative data gathering. Your car will continue with the current spec for now." Another silence. This one heavier. Charged. And then Hamilton stood up. No theatrics. No shouting. Just a cold, deliberate departure as he pushed the chair back, looked at no one in particular, and walked out, the door closing behind him with a quiet but definitive click. From that moment, the weekend, and perhaps Ferrari's season, began to unravel. What followed wasn't visible to the public. It wasn't broadcast on team radios or captured by pit lane cameras. But behind the closed garage doors, in the hospitality suites and motorhome corridors, Ferrari was plunged into disarray. Engineers scrambled to manage the narrative, communication lines were overloaded, and internal groups began to form. Those loyal to Leclerc tried to downplay the incident, calling it a strategic test session. Those within Hamilton's camp were furious, accusing the team of favoritism and sabotage. In the following hours, It became clear that the decision to prioritize Leclerc with a new floor wasn't just a technical choice. It was political. It was calculated. And it was personal. According to several sources with knowledge of the situation, Leclerc's side of the garage had been lobbying behind the scenes for weeks to ensure the Monégasque retained a performance edge over his new teammate. Their argument? Leclerc's telemetry in previous races had been more stable, more consistent, more valuable to the development team. But others whispered that this was just a convenient excuse. That higher-ups in Ferrari, worried about losing Leclerc to a rival team if he felt overshadowed by Hamilton, had chosen to tip the scales. To keep him happy. To keep him dominant. And when confronted with this behind closed doors, team principal Frédéric Vasseur reportedly attempted to calm Hamilton, promising the new floor would be available for FP2. But the trust was already shattered. What Hamilton heard in that meeting wasn't just technical reasoning. He heard confirmation that there were forces within Ferrari actively working against him. That his presence, once hailed as historic, was now viewed by some as a threat to the established order. On Friday morning, the tension was impossible to ignore. Even the mechanics behaved differently. The usual light-hearted chatter was gone. Movements were mechanical, robotic. No eye contact. Hamilton arrived early but said nothing to the media. His PR team issued a short statement about internal procedural reviews, and the speculation began to swirl. The first practice session came and went. Leclerc's car looked sharp, precise, planted. Hamilton, by contrast, struggled. Oversteer through the S's. Lack of rear stability through Degner. Constant radio chatter as he tried to make sense of a car that felt fundamentally unbalanced. At one point he asked, "Is this the same configuration we discussed? Because it doesn't feel like it." The response was clipped. Vague. "We're within expected parameters, Lewis." The silence that followed was deafening. By Friday afternoon, the situation had deteriorated further. Hamilton was granted the new floor, but the performance difference remained, not just because of hardware, but because mentally, emotionally, he had already disconnected. The garage felt split. Engineers began to align themselves more clearly with one driver or the other. Conversations were guarded. Data sharing slowed. Strategy meetings became tense, with one senior analyst reportedly walking out mid-session after being accused of withholding comparative lap data. The internal war had begun in earnest. That evening, another confrontation took place. Hamilton demanded a private audience with Vasseur and several technical leads. In that room, the gloves came off. Hamilton laid out a list of grievances that had been building since pre-season testing. Delays in parts. Strategy inconsistencies. Lack of transparency in data analysis. But above all, he pointed to a culture within the team that seemed unwilling to truly embrace him as an equal. He spoke reportedly with calm clarity, but with a tone that made it clear he was not going to tolerate being treated as second class. And when he left that meeting, once again without a word to the press, it was clear to everyone, things had changed. The race itself on Sunday almost didn't matter. Leclerc finished P4. Hamilton limped home in P6. But every camera, every commentator, every fan watching knew the real story wasn't in the results. It was in the way Hamilton walked past Leclerc after the race without even a glance. In the way the mechanics gathered in two distinct groups for the post-race debrief. In the way Ferrari's top brass avoided questions about team unity. In the way whispers from inside the paddock grew louder. Ferrari wasn't just experiencing a rivalry. It was experiencing a rupture. And it might be irreversible. What was supposed to be a legacy-defining era for Lewis Hamilton at Ferrari has now become something darker. Something more uncertain. The dream of ending his career as the hero who brought glory back to Maranello is now clouded by politics, mistrust, and a fractured garage. Leclerc, for his part, has remained silent. No interviews. No clarifications. But perhaps silence speaks louder than words. Because in the world of Formula One, where every second counts and every detail matters, trust is everything. And once it's gone, no upgrade in the world can bring it back. Someone who was in the room that day, one of the few insiders brave enough to whisper about what actually happened, later described the atmosphere as something that didn't just feel tense, but volatile, like a storm cloud waiting for the tiniest spark to explode. Lewis Hamilton had just finished reviewing telemetry after a difficult FP1 session, and his body language already said more than his words ever could. shoulders slightly hunched, jaw visibly clenched, and eyes flickering from screen to screen with growing suspicion. Everyone else in the room pretended to stay focused on their monitors, but the truth was clear: they were watching him, not the data. An engineer, one who had only recently joined the team and didn't yet know when to hold back, tried to offer what he believed was a neutral technical explanation. He pointed to a screen that showed the overlays between the two Ferraris through Turn 6 and Sector 2. With a hesitant voice, he suggested that the pace difference might have come down to how energy deployment was handled on Charles Leclerc's car, highlighting a very subtle but undeniable boost in acceleration exiting the corner. It could be a mapping variance, he said, gesturing gently toward the trace on the monitor. Leclerc's car seems to be delivering slightly more deployment there. Might explain the speed delta into Turn 7. Lewis didn't answer right away. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the edge of the carbon desk, eyes scanning the data in silence. It wasn't just quiet, it was still, like everyone had unconsciously stopped moving, breathing, thinking. Then he spoke, his voice calm but carved from ice. "So it's telemetry now," he said, drawing the words out with surgical precision. "Next time, just say he's your golden boy and spare me the fake data." There was no raise in volume, no shout. But the impact landed harder than if he'd screamed. The room froze. The engineer, visibly rattled, didn't even try to defend himself. He quietly closed his laptop, collected his notes, and walked out of the room. No one saw him in the paddock again that weekend. Some said he booked an early flight home that same evening. Others claimed he had asked to be reassigned. Either way, he vanished. And that was just the beginning. By Friday morning, the entire team environment had become suffocating. It wasn't just the usual competitive tension that bubbles up between two elite drivers. It had grown into something personal, something heavy, something that made even seasoned engineers whisper in the hallways and avoid certain rooms at certain times. The Ferrari garage, usually so polished and composed, felt fractured. Mechanics kept their heads down, engineers communicated in hushed tones, and several staff members avoided even being in the same room as both drivers at once. People moved like they were walking on glass. No one wanted to be the next to make eye contact with Hamilton at the wrong time. The second free practice session started with most eyes not on the track, but on the pit wall, on the garage monitors, on the reaction shots. Charles Leclerc was flying. His lap times were crisp, his sectors near flawless, and his radio chatter calm and controlled. He was confident. Almost too confident. On the other side of the garage, Hamilton's session was anything but clean. He complained of understeer from the very first lap, calling the car unbalanced and numb at corner entry. His top-end speed was mysteriously down, even with DRS open. Several times, he radioed in frustration, asking for clarity on differential settings and brake bias adjustments that didn't seem to respond the way they had during simulation. Every lap looked like a battle. He was 7/10 off Leclerc by the end of the session. As the cars returned to the garage, Charles removed his helmet with the relaxed ease of someone who knows the job's already done. He smiled at his engineer, made a quick joke in French that got a chuckle from one of the techs, and walked into the debrief room carrying his water bottle and a quiet sense of confidence. He took his seat, crossed his legs, and began discussing corner entry feedback with the engineers. To an outsider, it might have seemed like just another day at the office. Then Hamilton walked in. He said nothing. No nod. No greeting. No eye contact. Still in his race suit, still wearing the post-session intensity on his face like a second helmet, he walked straight to the central monitor. He scrolled quickly through the overlays, narrowing in on Sector 2 again. Then, with eyes locked onto the data, he asked in a sharp voice, "Why is he getting more deployment out of Turn 6? That's not the same mapping I was told we were running." Silence. Everyone looked around, unsure whether to answer or even move. Before anyone from the engineering side could speak, Leclerc answered instead, not even looking up from his bottle. "Maybe ask your engineer," he said, his voice low but cutting, instead of crying about it. The tension in the room turned physical. People stopped breathing. One engineer slowly lowered his laptop lid as if bracing for impact. Hamilton didn't react instantly, but when he turned toward Charles, his expression was surgical. He took 2 slow steps forward and stood directly in front of him. Every word that came next was deliberate, weighted, and impossible to ignore. "You're not just disrespectful," Hamilton said, slowly, clearly, every syllable heavy. "You're delusional. You've had this team wrapped around your little finger since day one. But don't confuse favoritism with talent. Charles stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flinch. He just looked Lewis in the eye, unmoving, and replied with a kind of cold certainty that only comes from deep belief. You don't belong here, Lewis. You never did. This isn't your team. It's never going to be. That was the moment something inside Hamilton snapped. Without another word, he grabbed the telemetry tablet from the desk and hurled it across the room. The screen shattered into dozens of pieces as it hit the wall, glass and carbon fragments bouncing onto the floor. The sound rang out like a gunshot. Everyone in the room jumped. One engineer instinctively ducked. For a few seconds, no one moved. And then, as if summoned by fate, Frederick Vasseur walked in. He opened the door just in time to see the shattered tablet hit the floor. His eyes scanned the room, quickly assessing the faces, the body language, the emotional wreckage. Before he could say a word, Hamilton turned toward him and pointed, fury in his voice but still holding back the full explosion. "Is this what I came back to F1 for?" he said, voice tight. "To be second driver to a kid who thinks he owns the place? To get lied to about engine modes? To drive a car set up for someone else? To watch updates go to his side of the garage first while I get told to be patient?" Vasseur started to respond, but Hamilton didn't stop. He took a step forward and continued, now louder, voice cracking slightly with emotion. "I'm not here to babysit. I'm not here to play backup. I didn't come back to fade into the background while he gets treated like a goddamn messiah. You want to win titles? Then act like you've got two drivers. Or I swear to God, I walk before summer break." Leclerc crossed his arms, leaned back slightly, and said in a low voice that only made it worse, "You think anyone's going to beg you to stay? This isn't Mercedes. You're not protected here." That was when one of the senior engineers physically stepped between them, voice calm but insistent, "Enough. That's enough. Both of you." Neither driver moved. For a moment, it looked like someone might swing. Then Hamilton shook his head, turned, and walked out of the room. He didn't return for the post-session debrief. He didn't speak to the media. He ignored messages from his PR team. That night, rumors swirled that he had requested an emergency call with John Elkann himself. And some say that the content of that call might change everything, not just for Ferrari's season, but for Hamilton's entire future in Formula One. Is this how a team is supposed to operate? That was the question Lewis Hamilton hurled into the heart of the Ferrari debrief room, his voice laced with disbelief, frustration, and a venom that no one in the room had ever heard from him before. It wasn't a rhetorical question. It was a wound being opened in front of engineers, strategists, mechanics, and the very leadership that had promised him a fresh start. Lewis didn't speak like a man caught in the heat of the moment. He spoke like a man who had held back for too long. And now, every word felt like a blade. He wasn't yelling for effect. He was yelling because he felt betrayed. Deeply. Personally. Professionally. His eyes scanned the room not for answers, but for someone brave enough to acknowledge the truth he had been suppressing since preseason testing. The truth he had started suspecting when upgrade packages landed on only one side of the garage. The truth that had been confirmed silently in every team meeting where Leclerc's name came up before his. Where Charles was referred to as our future, while Lewis, seven-time world champion, global icon, living legend, was referenced as the signing. "You let this kid mock me," he snapped, gesturing with barely contained rage at Charles, whose expression was a volatile mix of contempt and forced calm. "You hand him everything under the table while I get what? Lip service? You think I don't know what's going on? You think I don't see how the setup data shifts between Fridays and Saturdays? You think I haven't noticed how tire strategy suddenly becomes reactive every time I'm ahead on pace?" No one moved. Not a single engineer, not a single strategist, not a single mechanic. Eyes darted away from Hamilton's, glancing instead at floor tiles, coffee cups, open telemetry files. Vasseur stood at the head of the room, his mouth slightly agape, uncertain whether to attempt control or let the storm burn itself out. But the moment he spoke, his voice louder than usual, more commanding than it had been all season, it was too late to regain control. "Enough. Both of you. This isn't the place." But Lewis didn't let him finish. Not now. Not after what he had endured. Not after the internal politics, the shifting priorities, the growing suspicion that he had been sold a fantasy. His voice rose higher, cutting through the room like an alarm bell. "You promised me parity," he shouted, his eyes locking onto Vassour's with something almost like betrayal. "You looked me in the eyes. In that glass-walled office with all the history behind you, the Schumacher posters, the Lauda memorabilia, all of it, you told me I would be treated like a leader. You said this would be a new chapter. That I would build something here. That we would build it together." And then more quietly, with bitterness that made the words heavier, "This isn't parity. This is sabotage." The air seemed to thin. Every second felt like a minute. The screen showing track temperatures had gone to sleep. The telemetry feed flickered once, then froze. Vassour's face lost all its color, his usual calm dismantled in front of everyone. His voice faltered, cracking slightly as he tried to respond with authority that no longer seemed to carry weight. "Lewis," he said, almost pleading, "we gave you what you asked for. The car, the support team, the simulator hours, the full spec updates. You have access to every single data point. If you're not comfortable, if you think this isn't working, then maybe we made a mistake. Maybe this wasn't the right decision after all." Those last words hit with the force of a collision. The silence that followed was total. Hamilton took 2 steps forward, his posture a mix of disbelief and barely restrained fury. "A mistake," he repeated, low and sharp. "You made the biggest mistake of your career. You didn't bring me here to build a legacy. You brought me here for optics. For headlines. For Instagram posts with your logo next to mine. You brought me here for PR, so you could say, 'Look who drives for Ferrari now.'" His voice grew louder with each accusation. "You used me to shine up your brand. To make yourselves relevant again. But you never wanted me to win. You wanted me to lift him. You wanted me to play mentor to your golden child. You wanted me to clean up your image and stay quiet while he got the best of everything." He turned and looked straight at Leclerc. "Is that what you wanted too, Charles? The legend beside you so your wins feel like coronations?" Charles didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, chest out, eyes blazing, voice unwavering. "You're a dinosaur, Lewis. You had your time. You think you're still at the top, but you're not. This isn't your era anymore. You're not the king. You're the ghost of one." It was the moment of ignition. The point of no return. Hamilton stared him down, their faces inches apart, the tension thick enough to taste. And then with a chilling calm, he leaned forward and said something so quietly only a few could hear, but everyone felt the impact. According to one staff member, Lewis called Charles an entitled brat, a little rat, and a spoiled Monaco puppet. No one intervened. Not yet. But then, just as things teetered on the edge of physical confrontation, the door opened, and security entered the room. Real security. Not team liaison staff. Actual security guards in black jackets with Ferrari emblems, earpieces flashing, postures alert. They scanned the situation, unsure how to proceed in a debrief room that looked more like a pressure cooker about to explode. One of them approached carefully. "Sir, we need to calm the situation down." Lewis didn't even turn to him. He kept his eyes on Leclerc. Then slowly, he walked past them all and headed toward the exit. But before he left, he said, loud enough for the room to absorb the weight of it, "I'm leaving this room on my own terms. Not because some rookie cried to management. Not because some suit got nervous. But because I know exactly what this is now. And I know I don't belong in a place that doesn't deserve my legacy." He walked out. No one followed. No one dared. He didn't attend the post-qualifying analysis. He skipped the evening briefing. The engineers waited. The strategists pinged him. The performance coach knocked on his door. No answer. Silence. Only silence. By the next morning, the paddock was on fire. Not literally. But in terms of gossip, speculation, rumors, it was volcanic. Whispers in the media center turned into breaking tweets. Hamilton's absence became headline news before Free Practice 3 even started. Theories emerged by the minute. Some said he had already booked a flight out of Suzuka. Others claimed he had asked for a legal review of his contract clause regarding competitive equity. A few believed he was ready to go public with Ferrari's internal communications. Sponsors began asking questions. Shell, whose top executives were in Japan for a high-profile summit, convened an urgent closed-door meeting with Ferrari's top brass. Richard Mille executives were seen pacing nervously. Puma had reportedly asked for a communication freeze pending clarification. Ferrari's legal department was on high alert, drafting statements, reviewing NDAs, preparing for damage control. And then, just before midnight on Saturday, it happened. On Lewis Hamilton's official X account, a post appeared. No photo. No caption. Just a black screen with white text, stark and haunting. Legacy is earned. Not given. Some teams forget that. Not me. Number 44-inch. The tweet hit the F1 world like a seismic wave. Every news outlet ran it. Every fan interpreted it. Every team took notice. But inside Ferrari, no one could sleep that night. Not the engineers. Not the PR staff. Not Vasseur. Because they all knew something had broken, and there would be no fixing it by Sunday. It was meant to be a quiet Sunday morning in Suzuka. The sun was still fighting through layers of mist that blanketed the paddock. Mechanics moved with focused precision, and engineers stared at data like priests interpreting ancient scripture. On the surface, everything looked normal, calm, controlled. But behind closed doors, a bomb had already gone off, and the shrapnel was about to tear through the illusion of stability that Formula One thrives on. It began not with a press release or a televised outburst, but with a fleeting Instagram story, no more than 9 seconds long, posted from a secondary account connected to Lewis Hamilton's inner circle. The assistant who uploaded it had worked with Hamilton for years, barely known to the public, always present but never seen. Until now. The video was simple. Unedited. No soundtrack, no dramatic angles. Just a single shot of Lewis sitting alone in the corner of his motorhome, hood pulled over his head, elbows on knees, staring blankly at the floor. He didn't speak. He didn't move. The only thing that spoke was the caption written in stark white text, surrounded by snakes. But I've always walked alone. It vanished 5 minutes after it was posted, but by then it was too late. The internet never forgets, and neither does the paddock. Within minutes, screenshots had made their way to encrypted group chats, first among team personnel, then to journalists, and inevitably to senior Ferrari management. The image was undeniable. The message, unmistakable. Hamilton was not just unhappy, he was betrayed. And Ferrari, with its blood-red legacy and its inflexible traditions, had become the target of one of the most passive-aggressive yet deeply personal public statements ever delivered by a driver of his stature. What followed wasn't a meeting or a negotiation. There was no attempt to clarify, to patch things up, or to delay. It was decisive, it was ruthless, and it was historic. At precisely 7:32 a.m., Hamilton was issued a formal termination letter from Ferrari. Delivered in person by a senior legal advisor and simultaneously via email, the document cited multiple violations of conduct, an irreparable breakdown of trust, and actions that compromised the integrity of Scuderia Ferrari. There was no severance package. No final race appearance. His paddock access was deactivated immediately. The red thread that connected him to the most iconic team in motorsport was cut clean, and it wasn't just cut, it was shredded in front of the world. By 8 a.m., security was seen removing black duffel bags from his motorhome. Engineers assigned to his side of the garage were quietly reassigned. His name was taken off the garage panels before lunchtime. Monitors that once displayed his live telemetry flickered off and never turned back on. The silence was louder than any radio message he'd ever delivered. No statement. No goodbye. No post. He didn't even return to say farewell to the crew he had handpicked. The man who had once been welcomed into Maranello like a savior had now become a ghost. Carlos Sainz, whose own career path had been disrupted by Hamilton's arrival at Ferrari, was visibly disturbed. He declined all media interviews that day, refused to appear in the paddock show, and left immediately after the race. His father, rally legend Carlos Sainz Sr., was spotted outside the Ferrari hospitality unit engaged in what could only be described as a fierce verbal altercation with a senior board member. Eyewitnesses reported raised voices, aggressive hand gestures, and a level of tension that had clearly built over weeks, if not months. Charles Leclerc, the golden boy of the Scuderia, faced the media with the charisma of a statue. When asked about the events of the morning, he kept his answers brief and surgical. "We're focused on the race. Nothing else." That was all he said. And when reporters tried to probe further, he walked away. Behind the scenes, Maranello was in chaos. Sponsors demanded clarity. Shareholders sent emergency inquiries. Legal teams began combing through NDAs, and PR consultants prepped draft statements that would never be released. No one could agree on how to spin the story, because there was no spinning it. The world had already decided. The damage was already done. The story had become myth before it was even confirmed. Speculation erupted. Was this a carefully planned exit strategy from Hamilton? Did he leak the story himself to force the team's hand? Was the video a final middle finger to a team that had promised him greatness, but instead handed him frustration, politics, and isolation? Or was it the result of a deeper betrayal, something personal, something explosive, that even the most well-connected insiders didn't yet know? There were whispers of arguments during strategy meetings, of favoritism in car development, of miscommunication so severe they bordered on sabotage. Some claimed that Hamilton had been shut out of key engineering decisions. Others believed his telemetry was being deliberately withheld. Every rumor seemed more outrageous than the last, yet in the vacuum left by silence, even the wildest stories began to feel plausible. Meanwhile, the paddock was electrified with anxiety. Team principals exchanged glances and quiet words in hospitality tents. PR teams scrambled to distance their drivers from the scandal. Mercedes was allegedly the first to reach out to Hamilton's team, offering support and discretion. McLaren sent feelers. Aston Martin made internal inquiries. Everyone wanted to know the same thing: what the hell just happened, and where was Lewis going next? As for Ferrari, their silence was deafening. Not a single official uttered Hamilton's name that weekend. Not once. The message was clear: they intended to erase him. To pretend none of it had happened. But erasing a 7-time world champion doesn't work like that. Erasing Lewis Hamilton, especially under circumstances this incendiary, is impossible. Fans flooded social media with theories and fury. Memes were created within hours. Hashtags exploded. Ferrari's social pages were swarmed with comments ranging from heartbreak to outright rage. What was meant to be a dominant season had become a firestorm of PR disasters, internal fractures, and irreversible public humiliation. Hamilton's disappearance from the grid was not just a personnel change. It was a reckoning. An indictment of everything that still goes wrong in modern Formula One when pride, politics, and ego are allowed to supersede talent, trust, and collaboration. He didn't leave with a final drive or a retirement announcement. He vanished. And in doing so, he said more than words ever could. Every driver, every team boss, every mechanic knew what had happened. They wouldn't say it publicly, not yet, but behind closed doors, the paddock understood. This wasn't just the end of a contract. It was the end of a dream. A warning to others. A moment in history so raw, so unforgiving, that it would be remembered long after this season was over. There would be no forgiveness. No fixing what had been broken. What had begun as the most hyped transfer in decades had disintegrated into one of the most spectacular collapses in sporting history. One social media post. 9 seconds. One caption. And a legacy forever altered. What happens next? Nobody knows. But the paddock is watching. Every journalist, every sponsor, every executive is waiting for the next move. Will Hamilton break his silence and scorch the earth? Will Ferrari double down on silence and hope it fades? Or will someone somewhere finally tell the truth? Whatever the outcome, one fact remains unshakable: Suzuka will never be remembered for the race that weekend. It will be remembered for the betrayal, the silence, and the exit that changed everything.